So today we're going to discuss ginger. There's two types of ginger. There's fresh ginger and there's dry ginger. It was Sun Si Miao, a famous TCM practitioner, that said, if you don't have fresh ginger, you can use dry ginger. This is completely wrong. All herbs cannot be substituted. They all have primary indications, secondary indications, and they all have different actions and reactions on the body. Never substitute herbs. But we're going to discuss dry ginger. Dry ginger is a very warm, aromatic herb, very pungent, a lot of flavor. Those strong, pungent herbs always warm the gas level. And when I say warm the gas level, it warms the gas to warm the fluid. And that's why Tadayoshi Maso's son, Nangai, always said that it's used for obstructed water toxins. That just means when gas cools down, it cannot warm fluids, and when fluids cannot warm, they become immobile, they become obstructed. The body can't use them. They move into empty spaces of the body and create these secondary indications. And what I mean by secondary indications is they can be variable. There are many. There's many disease names. There's so many variations depending on somebody's constitution and body types and causative factors. You always need to identify herbs according to its primary indication. And the primary indications of dry ginger, there's three. The early stages of dry ginger, the abdominal below the umbilicus starts to feel cool to cold, and it starts to get this mild abdominal distension. Mild abdominal distension just means the gas is cooling down and gas starts to expand. And that's why it starts to feel cool to cold, and then it starts to become distended. The second and more chronic stage of dry ginger is large abdominal distension. So the whole abdominal becomes distension. It feels tense and the skin feels rough to dry. Those two abdominals are very important because it will give you the time frame of dry ginger. But in both examples, they always have a wet tongue coating, because when water cannot warm properly, cold water moves through the body and you always get this wet tongue coating. The early stages will always be very thin white tongue coating because the fluids are cooling down, but it's always wet. The later stages of dry ginger, it's more of a white, thicker tongue coating, but excessively wet, with normally excessive salivation and spitting as well. And when you can understand those primary indications, then you can consider the secondary indications. It is like a tree, its trunk, and then it grows out to branches with leaves. So the trunk is their primary indications, and it branches out into variable secondary indications. But once you can identify the primary indications, then you consider the secondary indications. Because with dry ginger, there's so many variable secondary indications, from watery loose stool with no smell with undigested food, to coughing and spitting, excessive salivation, or dizziness, or intestinal rumbling, or frequent urination. It always depends on the time frame, what time frame that person is in and how badly that function has been impaired. But the early stages of dry ginger, where the abdominal feels cool to cold below the umbilicus with mild abdominal distension, means it's just starting to cool down. And what that generally always presents with is an aversion to cold, and especially the palms feel cold. People think that aversion to cold or feeling cold is to do with the heart circulation, but it has more to do with the small intestine function, because the small intestine function always sits above 40 degrees. It warms, transports foods and fluids. And what happens is when you're warming that lower pelvis, it warms the blood. And when it warms the blood, it causes the blood vessels to vasodilate, which allows the warmth to move to the extremities. And those earlier stages as well, you'll tend to get watery loose stool with undigested food with no smell. Always with dry ginger, especially with the diarrhea, the vomiting, the frequent urination, there's no heat in the fluid depth. So urination's always clear. Stools are always watery, loose, undigested food, not much of an odor. The vomiting, there's always a lot of excessive salivation and spitting and not much of an odor, because the fluids are not warming properly. And depending on where that water is accumulating, the body will present with different variations. But always, generally, the early stages of dry ginger, it's just that watery loose stool with undigested food. And the worse it gets, the more frequent it becomes, especially in the morning when the sun rises, because overnight the cold water will accumulate into that lower pelvis and the body will want to eliminate it as soon as you rise. So it's very common for these people to get like 2 to 3 watery loose stools with undigested food with very little odor as soon as they wake up in the morning. But they're the earliest stages of dry ginger. So as the water starts to cool down, it cannot warm, it will move into empty spaces, it will move up the body. So when it starts moving up the body, you can start to get intestinal rumbling because the water cannot move. When it moves up near the diaphragm, you'll start to get retching and nausea. If it moves up above the diaphragm, you'll start to get vomiting, again with excessive salivation, with little odor. The water moves up through the chest and lungs, you start to get cough and shortness of breath with excessive salivation. If it starts to move up into the head, you'll start to get dizziness. So it's always where that water moves. And that's why these second indications, they'll give you an idea on its time frame and where the obstructed water is. But the more chronic version of dry ginger, and you do see this a lot in the clinic, is this large abdominal distension, and then it feels tense. And then as that gets worse, you'll get this rough, dry skin because the body now can no longer warm metabolize fluids properly. It's starting to dry and harden. Think of when you boil water, that heat needs to heat up the fluids to steam the moisture. That's what the small intestine function does. That's what dry ginger does. It creates the heating through the gas level to warm the fluids, to move the fluids, to turn cold water into functional fluids, fluids the body can use. And in that later stage of dry ginger, with this large abdominal distension, when the skin starts to dry and harden, it means the body is basically drying out. So imagine like the desert where the soil hardens, water moves off the soil too quickly. It's the same with the body. The water, you'll drink water and it'll move through the body too quickly. And that's why these types of chronic later stage dry ginger patterns, they always have frequent urination, especially at night time. They usually get up at night time 2 to 3 times to urinate because the gas level is cooled down, it can't warm the fluids and the water will move through, it can't control the water properly. And when the body starts to dry out, it creates like this empty heat in the body. So the body's starting to dry and heat up, and that heat always moves up into the chest, into the heart. And that's why you always get this vexation, agitation, insomnia. They always feel hot no matter the temperature, especially in Australia. You'll see people that drink a lot of alcohol and all year round, regardless of the temperature they use, they always wear singlets, t-shirts, shorts, thongs. They are always hot because when this starts to dry and harden, that gas expands, everything cools down, the warmth can't get back into the body again. So they always feel hot, they always feel vexed, agitated, or they always have trouble getting to sleep because as soon as you put pressure on the heart, it increases the heart rate and you get this vexation, agitation, insomnia because the heart rate needs to slow down. It needs to slow down so you get a good deep sleep. And dried ginger is one of those herbs that are forgotten about with insomnia, but it is amazing when you identify the primary indications and you can identify when to use dried ginger for this vexation, agitation, and insomnia. So remember, dried ginger is this very strong, aromatic, pungent herb. It has very structured signs and symptoms, very structured primary indications and variable secondary indications depending on where that water is. But it is an amazing herb and the effects are immediate, especially the early stages of dry ginger patterns where it starts to feel a little bit cool to cold and a little bit distended by the umbilicus. If you prescribe it correctly, it's within 3 to 5 days, there is a massive improvements. The more chronic later stages with the abdominal distension when the body starts to dry and harden with this rough, dry skin, this is more of a like 3 to 5 weeks because the pattern has progressed into a state where everything's dried and hard and you need to restore the movement to warm gas, to warm the fluids, to hydrate the body. So that pattern is a little bit slow, but its effects are obvious every 3 to 5 days. Always when herbs are correct, the effects are obvious within 2 to 3 days, regardless of the time frame of the disease presentation.